Morning they discharged me from Mercy General after 22 months. Nobody was waiting in the lobby. I remember standing at the automatic doors, watching them slide open and closed like they couldn't decide whether to let me out or keep me in. A nurse named Deborah, she'd been with me through most of the physical therapy, put her hand on my shoulder and said, "You sure someone's coming?" I told her yes. I don't know why I said that. I just didn't want her to feel bad. I called a cab. The drive from the hospital to what used to be my neighborhood took about 40 minutes. I watched the highway signs go by. Columbus, Worthington, Dublin. All the same exits I'd driven past 1,000 times in my life. But something about seeing them through a cab window felt like looking at old photographs of a house you grew up in. Familiar, but not quite yours anymore. My name is Edward Callum. I turned 63 last March. And the story I'm about to tell you is the one I spent 2 years lying in a hospital bed trying to figure out how to survive. I built Callum Pipe and Supply from scratch, not from my father's money, not from an inheritance, not from a lucky break, from scratch. I started the business in 1989 with $11,000 I'd saved working construction summers all through college and the 3 years after. I leased a warehouse out near the rail yards on the east side of Columbus. Bought used equipment, hired 2 guys I trusted, and started supplying industrial plumbing components to contractors across central Ohio. By 2019, Callum Pipe and Supply had 31 employees, contracts with 4 of the largest commercial construction firms in the state, and annual revenues just under $18 million. We weren't flashy. We didn't make anybody's list of fastest growing companies. We just showed up, did the work, and kept our word for 30 years. I had a good life, a house in Westerville, 4 bedrooms, the kind of backyard my wife Barbara had always wanted, 2 kids, grown and gone, a son named Jeffrey, who lived in Portland with his wife and our 2 grandchildren, a daughter named Pauline, who worked as a pharmacist in Cincinnati and called every Sunday without fail. Barbara passed in 2015, breast cancer. That was the first time I learned what it felt like to lose something you thought was permanent. But I had the business, I had the kids, I had enough to keep moving. My younger brother Dennis had worked at Callum Pipe since 2004. I brought him in when his landscaping business went under, not his fault, a bad partner situation, and he'd worked his way up over the years to operations manager. He knew the suppliers, knew the contractors, knew the rhythm of the place. I trusted him the way you trust someone you grew up sleeping in the same bedroom with, the way you trust someone whose father is your father. That was my first mistake. In September of 2021, I was driving back from a supplier meeting in Dayton when a driver ran a red light on Route 40 and hit my truck on the driver's side, going about 50 miles an hour. The doctors told me later that I was technically dead for about 4 minutes on the highway before the paramedics got me back. I don't remember any of it. I remember the supplier meeting. I remember stopping for gas. Then I remember a ceiling, white with a fluorescent light that buzzed faintly on the left side, and a nurse I'd never seen before telling me what month it was. I had a severe traumatic brain injury, 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and a fractured pelvis. I was in a medically induced coma for 6 weeks. After that, I was conscious, but not really. I could hear people talking around me, but the words wouldn't stick together properly. It took months before I could hold a conversation. More months before I could walk without a rail. During those months, Dennis came to visit. My daughter Pauline flew in and stayed for 3 weeks, then came back on weekends as often as she could. My son Jeffrey called every few days, but running a business can't wait for a man to recover from a traumatic brain injury. Dennis filed for emergency power of attorney over the business in October 2021, 6 weeks after the accident. Pauline had been listed as my medical POA. She handled my healthcare decisions. The business POA was something Dennis brought to the hospital with a lawyer I'd never met, and Pauline, trusting her uncle, not understanding the distinction, signed where they told her to sign. She was 34 years old and scared and exhausted, and they walked her through it in about 15 minutes. I didn't know any of this at the time. I was learning to hold a spoon again. When I got into that cab outside Mercy General in July of 2023, I thought I was going home. I had an address, a condo on the north side of Columbus. My daughter had helped arrange for me while I was finishing up physical therapy. The house in Westerville had been sold, she told me, to cover medical expenses. That stung, but I understood it. 22 months of inpatient care isn't cheap, even with good insurance. What I didn't know was how much else was gone. I found out in pieces, the way you usually find out the worst things. The first piece came 2 weeks after I got home, when I sat down with the statements my daughter had been keeping for me and tried to understand the financial picture. The business account I'd built for 30 years, the operating account, the savings reserve, the retirement fund I'd set up through the company, was gutted. There were large transfers going back to early 2022, most of them to an LLC I didn't recognize. Ardenwood Holdings. I called my accountant, a man named Gerald Fitch, who'd done my books for 17 years. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "Ed, I need you to come in. Bring your daughter." We drove to Gerald's office on a Tuesday morning. He had a folder on his desk and he didn't look at us when he started talking. He told me that Dennis had restructured the business in early 2022. Ardenwood Holdings had been incorporated in January of that year, with Dennis listed as sole managing member. By March, the majority of Callum Pipe and Supply's operating contracts had been transferred to Ardenwood. By June, the company's physical assets, the warehouse lease, the equipment, the inventory, had been sold to Ardenwood at a fraction of market value. Callum Pipe and Supplies still existed on paper, but it was a shell. The real business, my 30 years of work, was now Dennis's company. Gerald had raised concerns at the time and been told that I had authorized the restructuring. There were documents with my signature on them. I told Gerald I had never seen those documents in my life. He nodded slowly. He said he'd been afraid of that. The total value of assets transferred or liquidated, a little over $14 million. I sat in that chair in Gerald's office and I didn't say a word for a very long time. Pauline was crying next to me. I put my hand on her arm because I didn't know what else to do. Then I asked Gerald if he still had copies of everything. He said he did. He said he'd kept copies of everything going back 3 years, because something hadn't felt right, and he didn't know what else to do with that feeling. I told him he was a good man. I meant it. I went home that night and I sat in my kitchen with a yellow legal pad and I wrote down everything I could remember about the business, about Dennis, about the years before the accident. My handwriting was still shaky from the injury. The occupational therapist had worked with me on fine motor control for months, but I wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about the supplier relationships Dennis knew, the contractor contacts, the bank accounts and how they were structured. I wrote about the lawyer who'd come to the hospital with the POA documents. I wrote about Ardenwood Holdings and when Dennis might have started planning it, because I didn't think this started after my accident. I think Dennis had been watching, waiting, planning for longer than that. A man doesn't incorporate a shell company 2 weeks into his brother's coma without having thought about it before. I called my daughter that evening. I told her I wasn't angry with her for signing the POA documents. I meant that too. She had been trying to protect me and she had been taken advantage of. That was on Dennis, not on her. Then I told her I was going to need a lawyer. Her name was Renata Osei. She had an office in downtown Columbus and had spent 20 years doing commercial litigation with a focus on business fraud and asset misappropriation. Gerald had recommended her. When I sat across from her desk for the first time and laid out what I knew, she listened without interrupting, took notes in a precise, compact hand, and when I finished she looked up and said, "Mr. Callum, I want you to understand something. What you're describing is not complicated legally. It is fraud. The documentation challenge will be the signatures and the POA validity in the context of your medical capacity at the time. But I've handled more difficult cases than this." She told me to stop trying to contact Dennis. I had called him twice since getting out of the hospital. He'd answered the first time, sounded warm, almost too warm, asked how I was doing, said he'd been meaning to come by, and hadn't answered the second. Renata said that was fine. Let him feel comfortable. She spent the next 3 months building the case. She brought in a forensic accountant named Stuart Briggs, who specialized in exactly this kind of paper trail. Stuart found the transfers, found the undervalued asset sales, found the sequence of events. He also found something else. Dennis had added a business partner to Ardenwood Holdings in mid-2022, a man named Victor Ames, who happened to be Dennis's college roommate and who happened to have no prior experience in industrial supply. What Victor did have was a notary license, and his notary stamp appeared on several of the documents bearing my signature. Renata didn't smile often, but when Stuart showed her that, she came close. What I haven't told you yet is about my son Jeffrey. Jeffrey and I had always been close when he was growing up. He was the kind of kid who'd come out to the garage, where I was working on the truck just to keep me company, not because he wanted to help, just because he didn't mind being far away. He played baseball through high school, went to Ohio State, married a woman named Claire who I liked from the moment I met her. They have 2 girls, Maura and Dot, 6 and 4 years old now. When I was in the hospital, Jeffrey flew in twice in the first month. After that, Pauline told me the visits stopped. She said he'd been calling her less too. She didn't know why. I found out after I got home. Slowly, through things he let slip in phone calls. Dennis had told him things. That I'd been making bad decisions with the business before the accident. That I'd been drinking heavily. That my judgment had been slipping. That the restructuring had actually been my idea. In conversations I supposedly had with Dennis in the months before my accident, that I apparently don't remember because of the injury. Dennis had constructed an entire version of events and sold it to my son, who was 3 time zones away and scared and had no reason to doubt his uncle. Jeffrey hadn't cut me off completely, but there was a distance in his voice that hadn't been there before the accident, a carefulness, like he was talking to someone he wasn't sure he could trust. That hurt more than the $14 million. I want to be honest about that. I'd rebuilt businesses before, or I believed I could. I didn't know how to rebuild the way my son looked at me. Pauline was the one who finally told him. She sat him down on a video call. She told me later it took nearly 2 hours, and walked him through what Gerald had found, what Renata had documented, what Stuart had traced. She sent him copies of the POA documents, the transfer records, the notary stamps. Jeffrey called me the next morning. He was crying before I even said hello. He said, "Dad, I believed him. I am so sorry. I believed him over you." I told him the same thing I told Pauline. This was on Dennis, not on him. He had been manipulated by someone he'd known his whole life. That's not stupidity. That's trust being used as a weapon. We talked for 2 hours that morning, the best 2 hours I'd had since before the accident. The legal process moved faster than I expected, partly because Dennis didn't seem to believe he was actually at risk until very late. Renata said she'd seen that before. People who commit fraud over a long period start to believe the version of reality they've built. Dennis had lived inside his constructed story for over a year. He probably told it to himself so many times it had started to feel true. Victor Ames, when investigators came to him, did not feel the same way. Victor, it turned out, had not fully understood what he was participating in when he notarized documents he hadn't witnessed being signed. He cooperated with investigators within 48 hours of being contacted. He provided records, emails, text messages. The text messages were the thing. 2 years' worth of Dennis planning, adjusting, celebrating quietly, worrying, then reassuring himself. There was a message from January 2022 sent to Victor 9 days after the accident that read, "I've got maybe a year before he's functional again, probably longer. We need to move while the POA is clean." Renata showed me that message in her office. I read it twice. I thought about Dennis sitting in the hospital parking lot or at his kitchen table. My brother, typing those words 10 days after paramedics had to restart my heart on Route 40. I didn't cry. I'd done most of my crying alone in the months before that. What I felt was something quieter and colder and more settled. Dennis was charged with wire fraud, forgery, and misappropriation of business assets. Victor Ames pled to a lesser charge in exchange for his cooperation. Dennis's attorney tried to negotiate. Renata let him try for a while and then told him what the text messages said, and the negotiation changed characters significantly after that. Dennis received 6 years in federal prison. He will serve at least 4. I want to be clear about something. I didn't pursue this because I wanted Dennis in prison. I pursued it because he took something I built with 30 years of my life, and I needed it back, or at least the accounting of it back. The prison sentence was the court's decision. I testified at sentencing, and I said what I'm saying now. I don't hate my brother. I don't know what I feel toward him, exactly. Something without a clean name. The civil recovery process took another 8 months after the criminal conviction. Ardenwood Holdings was dissolved by court order. The assets that could be recovered were recovered, about 60% of the total, after legal fees and what Dennis had already spent or moved. The warehouse equipment had been sold to a contractor in Cleveland who'd bought it in good faith and had to be compensated separately. Some of the contract relationships were gone permanently. A couple of the larger construction firms had moved on during the 2 years Ardenwood was operating and weren't coming back. What I recovered was not everything. I want to say that plainly because I've seen these kinds of stories, where the ending ties up perfectly, where every dollar comes back and justice is complete and the world is orderly again. That's not what happened. What happened is that I got back enough to start over, and I got back something more important, which was the truth in the clear light of day, where everyone could see it. Gerald Fitch helped me set up a new entity, Callum Industrial Supply. Simpler name, simpler structure. I brought back 4 of my original employees who had stayed in the Columbus area. My son Jeffrey drove out from Portland in March and spent a week helping me set up the new office space. He and Claire brought the girls. Maura and Dot spent most of that week drawing on every piece of blank paper in the office and feeding crackers to the pigeons out front of the building. I'm 63 years old and I'm starting a business for the second time, and I'm not going to pretend that isn't hard. Some mornings I sit in the new office before anyone else gets in, and I drink my coffee, and I think about what 30 years feels like when it's taken from you and what it feels like to try to build it again. The building is smaller now. The contracts are smaller. I'm starting with 7 clients instead of 40, but when Pauline calls on Sunday evenings, I tell her honestly that I'm okay. When Jeffrey calls on weekday mornings before the girls wake up, I tell him the same thing, not because I'm protecting them, because it's true. There's one more thing I want to say, because the questions I get when I tell pieces of this story are almost always about whether the justice was complete, whether it was enough. And I understand those questions. I ask them myself. Dennis is in federal prison in Elkton, Ohio. Victor Ames lost his notary license and is on probation. The legal record of what happened, the court filings, the judgment, the documented fraud, exists and is permanent. My name is clear. There are things that can't be fully restored. The specific relationships I had with certain clients for 20-25 years, that trust took decades to build, and it dissolved in the 18 months Dennis was running things under my name. Some of those men and women have retired. Some have moved on. Some simply had to find other suppliers to survive, and they're not going to switch back for the sake of loyalty to a man who wasn't there. My brother's relationship with my children will never be what it was. My daughter barely speaks his name now. My son is polite about it because that's the kind of man he is, but I know what he's carrying, and I'm still rebuilding the physical capacity I lost in that accident. There are mornings my hands shake and I have to wait them out. There are words that take longer to find than they used to. The neurologist tells me the improvement curve is long and gradual, and that I've made remarkable progress. I take the remarkable progress and I try to be grateful for it. What I have is this: I am vertical. I am building something. My children know the truth, and I know they love me. And when I sit in that new office before anyone else arrives and I drink my coffee in the quiet, I am not the man those papers tried to make me. Diminished, confused, taken apart. I am Edward Callum. I built something once, and I will build it again. Slower this time. With better eyes for what trust is worth and what it costs when someone decides to spend it for you. That's the whole story. That's all of it. People ask me sometimes if I'm bitter. They expect me to say no, the way people expect a certain kind of answer when they ask a certain kind of question. But I'm 63 years old, and I've earned the right to be honest about this, yes. For a while I was. Not the loud, hot kind of bitter that makes you say things you regret. The cold, quiet kind. The kind that sits at the kitchen table with you at 2 in the morning and doesn't say anything. What I've come to understand, and it took longer than I'd like to admit, is that what Dennis did wasn't just about greed. It was about the choices a person makes when they believe nobody is watching, and nothing will catch up to them. He looked at me, lying in that hospital bed, and he made a calculation. He decided that my vulnerability was his opportunity, and that calculation, that specific choice to treat a brother's worst moment as a business transaction, was the thing that built the walls of a federal prison cell around him, not a court, not a judge. His own decision made freely, years before any of it came to light. That's what I mean when I say I don't believe in luck anymore. Not the way I used to. I used to think outcomes were random, that bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people, and it was mostly just the spin of the wheel. After everything that happened, I think differently. I think the choices we make accumulate. They build structures, and eventually, you end up living inside the structure your choice is built. Whether that structure is a business you're proud of or a prison in Elkton, Ohio. I think about my daughter Pauline, who drove back and forth from Cincinnati on weekends when I couldn't hold a conversation, who kept every financial statement in a folder because something in her gut said to. She didn't do that because she was certain it would matter. She did it because it was right, and because she loved me, and because that's the kind of person she chose to become. That choice, made quietly, without any guarantee of reward, was part of what gave me back my life. And Jeffrey, my son, believed a lie for over a year because he was scared and far away and trusted someone he'd known since childhood. When he found out the truth, he didn't protect himself. He called me, and he cried, and he said he was sorry. That took something. That took the kind of honesty that's harder than silence, and I'll respect him for it for the rest of my life. What I want to say to anyone listening to this is simple. Intelligence isn't knowing every angle before it happens. Intelligence is keeping records when something doesn't feel right, the way Gerald did. It's asking questions when the paperwork doesn't match the story. The people who nearly lost everything in this story were not foolish people. They were trusting people, which is different. Trust is not a weakness, but trust without attention is. And resilience, that word gets used a lot, and I think it's gotten soft from overuse. What it actually means is that you get up when there's no obvious reason to, when you're not sure it's worth it, when your hands shake and your words come slower than they used to. You get up not because you're brave, but because sitting down permanently is the only thing that would actually finish you off. I'm building something again, smaller, slower, with better eyes. That's enough. Some mornings, it's more than enough.